My dear wanderers, there are journeys that begin not with a dream, but with a breaking. For some, it's a choice. For others, it's a quiet surrender to something bigger, harsher, and more honest than the life they've known. The sea has a way of finding such souls. It calls them, not with promises of adventure, but with the truth of who they are when no one is watching. When Richard Henry Dana left the warmth of Harvard and stepped aboard that merchant ship, he wasn't chasing glory. He was searching for something we all crave, but rarely admit clarity. Out there, where salt stings your skin and the wind never sleeps, the sea strips you bare. It takes your pride, your name, your comfort, until all that's left is what can't be taken, your will to endure. For 2 long years he sailed not as a scholar, but as a man among men. He learned the language of storms, the rhythm of toil, the strange tenderness of hardship shared in silence. And in the endless horizon, he found both the cruelty and the mercy of the world, as if the ocean itself was teaching him that they are one and the same. Tonight, we remember that journey, the creak of the deck beneath your feet, the cold mist that blurs the line between breath and memory, the sound of ropes straining like human hearts, always pulled, never free. So take a slow breath, my friend. Let the tide carry you not forward, not back, just inward. Because every man who's ever faced the sea knows, you don't conquer it, you learn to listen. Chapter I. The 14th of August was the day fixed upon for the sailing of the brig Pilgrim on her voyage from Boston, round Cape Horn, to the western coast of North America. As she was to get underway early in the afternoon, I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock, in full sea rig, with my chest, containing an outfit for a 2 or 3 years voyage, which I had undertaken from a determination to cure, if possible, by an entire change of life, and by a long absence from books, with a plenty of hard work, plain food, and open air, a weakness of the eyes, which had obliged me to give up my studies, and which no medical aid seemed likely to remedy. The change from the tight frock coat, silk cap, and kid gloves of an undergraduate at Harvard to the loose duck trousers, checked shirt, and tarpaulin hat of a sailor, though somewhat of a transformation, was soon made, and I supposed that I should pass very well for a Jack Tar. But it is impossible to deceive the practiced eye in these matters, and while I thought myself to be looking as salt as Neptune himself, I was, no doubt, known for a landsman by everyone on board as soon as I hove in sight. A sailor has a peculiar cut to his clothes, and a way of wearing them which a green hand can never get. The trousers, tight round the hips, and thence hanging long and loose round the feet, a superabundance of checked shirt, a low-crowned, well-varnished black hat, worn on the back of the head, with half a fathom of black ribbon hanging over the left eye, and a slip tie to the black silk neckerchief, with sundry other minutiae, are signs, the want of which betrays the beginner at once. Besides the points in my dress which were out of the way, doubtless my complexion and hands were quite enough to distinguish me from the regular salt who, with a sunburnt cheek, wide step, and rolling gait, swings his bronzed and toughened hands athwartships, half opened, as though just ready to grasp a rope. With all my imperfections on my head, I joined the crew, and we hauled out into the stream, and came to anchor for the night. The next day, we were employed in preparation for sea, reeving studding sail gear, crossing royal yards, putting on chafing gear, and taking on board our powder. On the following night, I stood my first watch. I remained awake nearly all the first part of the night, from fear that I might not hear when I was called, and when I went on deck, so great were my ideas of the importance of my trust, that I walked regularly fore and aft the whole length of the vessel, looking out over the bows and taffrail at each turn, and was not a little surprised at the coolness of the old seaman whom I called to take my place, in stowing himself snugly away under the longboat for a nap. That was a sufficient lookout, he thought, for a fine night, at anchor in a safe harbour. The next morning was Saturday, and, a breeze having sprung up from the southward, we took a pilot on board, hove up our anchor, and began beating down the bay. I took leave of those of my friends who came to see me off, and had barely opportunity for a last look at the city and well-known objects, as no time is allowed on board ship for sentiment. As we drew down into the lower harbour, we found the wind ahead in the bay, and were obliged to come to anchor in the roads. We remained there through the day and a part of the night. My watch began at 11 o'clock at night, and I received orders to call the captain if the wind came out from the westward. About midnight the wind became fair, and, having summoned the captain, I was ordered to call all hands. How I accomplished this, I do not know, but I am quite sure that I did not give the true hoarse boatswain call of all hands, up anchor, ahoy. In a short time everyone was in motion, the sails loosed, the yards braced, and we began to heave up the anchor, which was our last hold upon Yankee land. I could take but small part in these preparations. My little knowledge of a vessel was all at fault. Unintelligible orders were so rapidly given, and so immediately executed. There was such a hurrying about, and such an intermingling of strange cries and stranger actions, that I was completely bewildered. There is not so helpless and pitiable an object in the world as a landsman beginning a sailor's life. At length those peculiar, long-drawn sounds which denote that the crew are heaving at the windlass began, and in a few minutes we were under way. The noise of the water thrown from the bows was heard. The vessel leaned over from the damp night breeze, and rolled with the heavy ground swell, and we had actually begun our long journey. This was literally bidding good night to my native land. Chapter I. The 14th of August was the day fixed upon for the sailing of the brig Pilgrim on her voyage from Boston, round Cape Horn, to the western coast of North America. As she was to get under way early in the afternoon, I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock, in full sea rig, with my chest, containing an outfit for a 2 or 3 years' voyage, which I had undertaken from a determination to cure, if possible, by an entire change of life, and by a long absence from books, with a plenty of hard work, plain food, and open air, a weakness of the eyes, which had obliged me to give up my studies, and which no medical aid seemed likely to remedy. The change from the tight frock coat, silk cap, and kid gloves of an undergraduate at Harvard to the loose duck trousers, checked shirt, and tarpaulin hat of a sailor, though somewhat of a transformation, was soon made, and I suppose that I should pass very well for a jack tar. But it is impossible to deceive the practiced eye in these matters, and while I thought myself to be looking as salt as Neptune himself, I was, no doubt, known for a landsman by everyone on board as soon as I hove in sight. A sailor has a peculiar cut to his clothes, and a way of wearing them which a green hand can never get. The trousers, tight round the hips, and thence hanging long and loose round the feet, a superabundance of checked shirt, a low-crowned, well-varnished black hat, worn on the back of the head, with half a fathom of black ribbon hanging over the left eye, and a slip-tie to the black silk neckerchief, with sundry other minutiae, are signs, the want of which betrays the beginner at once. Besides the points in my dress which were out of the way, doubtless my complexion and hands were quite enough to distinguish me from the regular salt who, with a sunburnt cheek, wide step, and rolling gait, swings his bronzed and toughened hands athwart ships, half opened, as though just ready to grasp a rope. With all my imperfections on my head, I joined the crew, and we hauled out into the stream, and came to anchor for the night. The next day we were employed in preparation for sea, reeving studding sail gear, crossing royal yards, putting on chafing gear, and taking on board our powder. On the following night, I stood my first watch. I remained awake nearly all the first part of the night from fear that I might not hear when I was called, and when I went on deck, so great were my ideas of the importance of my trust, that I walked regularly fore and aft the whole length of the vessel, looking out over the bows and taffrail at each turn, and was not a little surprised at the coolness of the old seaman whom I called to take my place, in stowing himself snugly away under the longboat for a nap. That was a sufficient lookout, he thought, for a fine night, at anchor in a safe harbour. The next morning was Saturday, and, a breeze having sprung up from the southward, we took a pilot on board, hove up our anchor, and began beating down the bay. I took leave of those of my friends who came to see me off, and had barely opportunity for a last look at the city and well-known objects, as no time is allowed on board ship for sentiment. As we drew down into the lower harbour, we found the wind ahead in the bay, and were obliged to come to anchor in the roads. We remained there through the day and a part of the night. My watch began at 11 o'clock at night, and I received orders to call the captain if the wind came out from the westward. About midnight, the wind became fair, and, having summoned the captain, I was ordered to call all hands. How I accomplished this, I do not know, but I am quite sure that I did not give the true hoarse boatswain call of a "All-ha-uns up anchor," a "ho-oy." In a short time, everyone was in motion. The sails loosed, the yards braced, and we began to heave up the anchor, which was our last hold upon Yankee land. I could take but small part in these preparations. My little knowledge of a vessel was all at fault. Unintelligible orders were so rapidly given, and so immediately executed. There was such a hurrying about, and such an intermingling of strange cries and stranger actions, that I was completely bewildered. There is not so helpless and pitiable an object in the world as a landsman beginning a sailor's life. At length those peculiar, long-drawn sounds which denote that the crew are heaving at the windlass began, and in a few minutes we were under way. The noise of the water thrown from the bows was heard. The vessel leaned over from the damp night breeze, and rolled with the heavy groundswell, and we had actually begun our long journey. This was literally bidding good night to my native land. Chapter 3. As we have now had a long spell of fine weather, without any incident to break the monotony of our lives, I may have no better place for a description of the duties, regulations, and customs of an American merchantman, of which ours was a fair specimen. The captain, in the first place, is Lord Paramount. He stands no watch, comes and goes when he pleases, is accountable to no one, and must be obeyed in everything, without a question even from his chief officer. He has the power to turn his officers off duty, and even to break them and make them do duty as sailors in the forecastle. Where there are no passengers and no supercargo, as in our vessel, he has no companion but his own dignity and few pleasures, unless he differs from most of his kind, beyond the consciousness of possessing supreme power and, occasionally, the exercise of it. The Prime Minister, the official organ, and the active and superintending officer is the chief mate. He is first lieutenant, boatswain, sailing master, and quartermaster. The captain tells him what he wishes to have done, and leaves to him the care of overseeing, of allotting the work, and also the responsibility of its being well done. The mate, as he is always called, par excellence, also keeps the logbook, for which he is responsible to the owners and insurers, and has the charge of the stowage, safekeeping, and delivery of the cargo. He is also ex officio, the wit of the crew, for the captain does not condescend to joke with the men, and the second mate no one cares for, so that when the mate thinks fit to entertain the people with a coarse joke or a little practical wit, everyone feels bound to laugh. The second mate is proverbially a dog's berth. He is neither officer nor man. He is obliged to go aloft to reef and furl the topsails, and to put his hands into the tar and slush with the rest, and the men do not much respect him as an officer. The crew call him the sailor's waiter, as he has to furnish them with spun yarn, marline, and all other stuffs that they need in their work, and has charge of the boatswain's locker, which includes serving boards, marline spikes, and sea. He is expected by the captain to maintain his dignity and to enforce obedience, and still is kept at a great distance from the mate, and obliged to work with the crew. He is one to whom little is given, and of whom much is required. His wages are usually double those of a common sailor, and he eats and sleeps in the cabin, but he is obliged to be on deck nearly all his time, and eats at the second table, that is, makes a meal out of what the captain and chief mate leave. The steward is the captain's servant, and has charge of the pantry, from which everyone, even the mate himself, is excluded. These distinctions usually find him an enemy in the mate, who does not like to have anyone on board who is not entirely under his control. The crew do not consider him as one of their number, so he is left to the mercy of the captain. The cook, whose title is doctor, is the patron of the crew, and those who are in his favour can get their wet mittens and stockings dried, or light their pipes at the galley in the night watch. These two worthies, together with the carpenter and sailmaker, if there be one, stand no watch, but being employed all day, are allowed to sleep in at night, unless all hands are called. The crew are divided into two divisions, as equally as may be, called the watches. Of these, the chief mate commands the larboard, and the second mate the starboard. They divide the time between them, being on and off duty, or, as it is called, on deck and below, every other 4 hours. The 3 night watches are called the first, the middle, and the morning watch. If, for instance, the chief mate with the larboard watch have the first night watch from 8 to 12, at that hour the starboard watch and the second mate take the deck, while the larboard watch and the first mate go below until 4 in the morning, when they come on deck again and remain until 8, as the larboard watch will have been on deck 8 hours out of the 12, while the starboard watch will have been up only 4 hours. The former have what is called a forenoon watch below, that is, from 8 a.m. till 12. In a man of war, and in some merchantmen, this alternation of watches is kept up throughout the 24 hours, which is called having watch and watch. But our ship, like most merchantmen, had all hands from 12 o'clock till dark, except in very bad weather, when we were allowed watch and watch. An explanation of the dog watches may perhaps be necessary to one who has never been at sea. Their purpose is to shift the watches each night, so that the same watch shall not be on deck at the same hours throughout a voyage. In order to effect this, the watch from 4 to 8 p.m. is divided into 2 half watches, one from 4 to 6, and the other from 6 to 8. By this means they divide the 24 hours into 7 watches, instead of 6, and thus shift the hours every night. As the dog watches come during twilight, after the day's work is done, and before the night watch is set, they are the watches in which everybody is on deck. The captain is up, walking on the weather side of the quarterdeck, the chief mate on the lee side, and the second mate about the weather gangway. The steward has finished his work in the cabin, and has come up to smoke his pipe with the cook in the galley. The crew are sitting on the windlass or lying on the forecastle, smoking, singing, or telling long yarns. At 8 o'clock, 8 bells are struck, the log is hove, the watch set, the wheel relieved, the galley shut up, and the watch off duty goes below. The morning begins with the watch on decks turning to at daybreak and washing down, scrubbing and swabbing the decks. This, together with filling the scuttled butt with fresh water and coiling up the rigging, usually occupies the time until 7 bells, half after 7, when all hands get breakfast. At 8 the day's work begins and lasts until sundown, with the exception of an hour for dinner. Before I end my explanations, it may be well to define a day's work and to correct a mistake prevalent among landsmen about a sailor's life. Nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Are not sailors very idle at sea? What can they find to do?" This is a natural mistake, and being frequently made, is one which every sailor feels interested in having corrected. In the first place, then, the discipline of the ship requires every man to be at work upon something when he is on deck, except at night and on Sundays. At all other times you will never see a man, on board a well-ordered vessel, standing idle on deck, sitting down, or leaning over the side. It is the officer's duty to keep everyone at work, even if there is nothing to be done but to scrape the rust from the chain cables. In no state prison are the convicts more regularly set to work and more closely watched. No conversation is allowed among the crew at their duty, and though they frequently do talk when aloft or when near one another, yet they stop when an officer is nigh. With regard to the work upon which the men are put, it is a matter which probably would not be understood by one who has not been at sea. When I first left port and found that we were kept regularly employed for a week or 2, I supposed that we were getting the vessel into sea trim and that it would soon be over, and we should have nothing to do but to sail the ship. But I found that it continued so for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years, there was as much to be done as ever. As has often been said, a ship is like a lady's watch, always out of repair. When first leaving port, studding sail gear is to be rove, all the running rigging to be examined, that which is unfit for use to be got down, and new rigging rove in its place. Then the standing rigging is to be overhauled, replaced, and repaired in 1,000 different ways, and wherever any of the numberless ropes or the yards are chafing or wearing upon it, their chafing gear, as it is called, must be put on. This chafing gear consists of worming, parcelling, roundings, battens, and service of all kinds, rope yarns, spun yarn, marlin, and seizing stuffs, taking off, putting on, and mending the chafing gear alone, upon a vessel, would find constant employment for a man or 2 men, during working hours, for a whole voyage. The next point to be considered is, that all the small stuffs which are used on board a ship, such as spun yarn, marlin, seizing stuff, and sea, are made on board. The owners of a vessel buy up incredible quantities of old junk, which the sailors unlay, and, after drawing out the yarns, knot them together and roll them up in balls. These rope yarns are constantly used for various purposes, but the greater part is manufactured into spun yarn. For this purpose, every vessel is furnished with a spun yarn winch, which is very simple, consisting of a wheel and spindle. This may be heard constantly going on deck in pleasant weather, and we had employment, during a great part of the time, for 3 hands, in drawing and knotting yarns, and making spun yarn. Another method of employing the crew is setting up rigging. Whenever any of the standing rigging becomes slack, which is continually happening, the seizings and coverings must be taken off, tackles got up, and, after the rigging is bowsed well taut, the seizings and coverings be replaced, which is a very nice piece of work. There is also such a connection between different parts of a vessel that one rope can seldom be touched without requiring a change in another. You cannot stay a mast aft by the backstays without slacking up the headstays, and see. If we add to this all the tarring, greasing, oiling, varnishing, painting, scraping, and scrubbing which is required in the course of a long voyage, and also remember this is all to be done, in addition to watching at night, steering, reefing, furling, bracing, making and setting sail and pulling, hauling and climbing in every direction. One will hardly ask, what can a sailor find to do at sea? If, after all this labour, after exposing their lives and limbs in storms, wet and cold, wherein the cub-drawn bear would couch, the lion and the belly-pinched wolf keep their furs dry, the merchants and captains think that the sailors have not earned their $12 a month, out of which they clothe themselves, and their salt beef and hard bread, they keep them picking oakum ad infinitum. This is the usual resource upon a rainy day, for then it will not do to work upon rigging, and when it is pouring down in floods, instead of letting the sailors stand about in sheltered places, and talk, and keep themselves comfortable, they are separated to different parts of the ship and kept at work picking oakum. I have seen oakum stuff placed about in different parts of the ship, so that the sailors might not be idle in the snatches between the frequent squalls upon crossing the equator. Some officers have been so driven to find work for the crew in a ship ready for sea, that they have set them to pounding the anchors, often done, and scraping the chain cables. The Philadelphia Catechism is, 6 days shalt thou labour, and do all thou art able, and on the 7th, holystone the decks and scrape the cable. This kind of work, of course, is not kept up off Cape Horn, Cape of Good Hope, and in extreme north and south latitudes, but I have seen the decks washed down and scrubbed when the water would have frozen if it had been fresh, and all hands kept at work upon the rigging, when we had on our pea jackets, and our hands so numb that we could hardly hold our marlin spikes. I have here gone out of my narrative course, in order that any who read this may, at the start, form as correct an idea of a sailor's life and duty as possible. I have done it in this place because, for some time, our life was nothing but the unvarying repetition of these duties, which can be better described together. Before leaving this description, however, I would state, in order to show landsmen how little they know of the nature of a ship, that a ship carpenter is kept constantly employed, during good weather, on board vessels which are in what is called perfect sea order. Chapter 1. After speaking the Carolina, on the 21st of August, nothing occurred to break the monotony of our life until Friday, September 5th, when we saw a sail on our weather, starboard, beam. She proved to be a brig under English colours, and, passing under our stern, reported herself as 49 days from Buenos Aires, bound to Liverpool. Before she had passed us, "Sail ho," was cried again, and we made another sail, broad on our weather bow, and steering athwart our hawse. She passed out of hail, but we made her out to be an hermaphrodite brig, with Brazilian colours in her main rigging. By her course, she must have been bound from Brazil to the south of Europe, probably Portugal. Sunday, September 7th, fell in with the northeast trade winds. This morning we caught our first dolphin, which I was very eager to see. I was disappointed in the colours of this fish when dying. They were certainly very beautiful, but not equal to what has been said of them. They are too indistinct. To do the fish justice, there is nothing more beautiful than the dolphin when swimming a few feet below the surface, on a bright day. It is the most elegantly formed, and also the quickest, fish in salt water, and the rays of the sun striking upon it, in its rapid and changing motions, reflected from the water, make it look like a stray beam from a rainbow. This day was spent, like all pleasant Sundays at sea. The decks are washed down, the rigging coiled up, and everything put in order, and throughout the day, only one watch is kept on deck at a time. The men are all dressed in their best white duck trousers and red or checked shirts, and have nothing to do but to make the necessary changes in the sails. They employ themselves in reading, talking, smoking, and mending their clothes. If the weather is pleasant, they bring their work and their books upon deck, and sit down upon the forecastle and windlass. This is the only day on which these privileges are allowed them. When Monday comes, they put on their tarry trousers again, and prepare for 6 days of labour. To enhance the value of Sunday to the crew, they are allowed on that day a pudding, or, as it is called, a duff. This is nothing more than flour boiled with water and eaten with molasses. It is very heavy, dark and clammy, yet it is looked upon as a luxury, and really forms an agreeable variety with salt beef and pork. Many a rascally captain has made up with his crew, for hard usage, by allowing them duff twice a week on the passage home. On board some vessels, Sunday is made a day of instruction and of religious exercises, but we had a crew of swearers, from the captain to the smallest boy, and a day of rest, and of something like quiet, social enjoyment, was all that we could expect. We continued running large before the northeast trade winds for several days, until Monday, September 22d, when, upon coming on deck at 7 bells in the morning, we found the other watch aloft throwing water upon the sails, and, looking astern, we saw a small clipper-built brig, with a black hull heading directly after us. We went to work immediately, and put all the canvas upon the brig, which we could get upon her, rigging out oars for extra studding sail yards, and continued wetting down the sails by buckets of water, whipped up to the masthead, until about 9 o'clock, when there came on a drizzling rain. The vessel continued in pursuit, changing her course as we changed ours, to keep before the wind. The captain, who watched her with his glass, said that she was armed and full of men, and showed no colours. We continued running dead before the wind, knowing that we sailed better so, and that clippers are fastest on the wind. We had also another advantage. The wind was light, and we spread more canvas than she did, having royals and skysails fore and aft, and 10 studding sails, while she, being an hermaphrodite brig, had only a gaff topsail aft. Early in the morning she was overhauling us a little, but after the rain came on and the wind grew lighter, we began to leave her astern. All hands remained on deck throughout the day, and we got our firearms in order, but we were too few to have done anything with her if she had proved to be what we feared. Fortunately, there was no moon, and the night which followed was exceedingly dark, so that, by putting out all the lights on board and altering our course 4 points, We hoped to get out of her reach. We removed the light in the binnacle and steered by the stars and kept perfect silence through the night. At daybreak, there was no sign of anything in the horizon, and we kept the vessel off to her course. Wednesday, October 1st. Crossed the equator in Lon, 24 degrees, 24 W. I now, for the first time, felt at liberty, according to the old usage, to call myself a son of Neptune, and was very glad to be able to claim the title without the disagreeable initiation which so many have to go through. After once crossing the line, you can never be subjected to the process, but are considered as a son of Neptune, with full powers to play tricks upon others. This ancient custom is now seldom allowed, unless there are passengers on board, in which case there is always a good deal of sport. It had been obvious to all hands for some time that the second mate, whose name was Foster, was an idle, careless fellow, and not much of a sailor, and that the captain was exceedingly dissatisfied with him. The power of the captain in these cases was well known, and we all anticipated a difficulty. Foster, called Mr., by virtue of his office, was but half a sailor, having always been short voyages, and remained at home a long time between them. His father was a man of some property, and intended to have given his son a liberal education, but he, being idle and worthless, was sent off to sea, and succeeded no better there, for, unlike many scamps, he had none of the qualities of a sailor. He was not of the stuff that they make sailors of. He used to hold long yarns with the crew, and talk against the captain, and play with the boys, and relax discipline in every way. This kind of conduct always makes the captain suspicious, and is never pleasant, in the end, to the men, they preferring to have an officer active, vigilant, and distant as may be with kindness. Among other bad practices, he frequently slept on his watch, and, having been discovered asleep by the captain, he was told that he would be turned off duty if he did it again. To prevent his sleeping on deck, the hen coops were ordered to be knocked up, for the captain never sat down on deck himself, and never permitted an officer to do so. The second night after crossing the equator, we had the watch from 8 till 12, and it was my helm for the last 2 hours. There had been light squalls through the night, and the captain told Mr. Foster, who commanded our watch, to keep a bright lookout. Soon after I came to the helm, I found that he was quite drowsy, and at last he stretched himself on the companion and went fast asleep. Soon afterwards, the captain came softly on deck and stood by me for some time looking at the compass. The officer at length became aware of the captain's presence, but, pretending not to know it, began humming and whistling to himself to show that he was not asleep, and went forward, without looking behind him, and ordered the main royal to be loosed. On turning round to come aft, he pretended surprise at seeing the master on deck. This would not do. The captain was too wide awake for him, and beginning upon him at once, gave him a grand blow-up, in true nautical style. "You're a lazy, good-for-nothing rascal. You're neither man, boy, soldier, nor sailor. You're no more than a thing aboard a vessel. You don't earn your salt. You're worse than a Mahon soldier," and other still more choice extracts from the sailor's vocabulary. After the poor fellow had taken this harangue, he was sent into his stateroom, and the captain stood the rest of the watch himself. At 7 bells in the morning, all hands were called aft, and told that Foster was no longer an officer on board, and that we might choose one of our own number for second mate. It is not uncommon for the captain to make this offer, and it is good policy, for the crew think themselves the choosers, and are flattered by it, but have to obey, nevertheless. Our crew, as is usual, refused to take the responsibility of choosing a man of whom we would never be able to complain, and left it to the captain. He picked out an active and intelligent young sailor, born on the banks of the Kennebec, who had been several Canton voyages, and proclaimed him in the following manner: "I choose Jim Hall. He's your second mate. All you've got to do is to obey him as you would me, and remember that he is Mr. Hall." Foster went forward into the forecastle as a common sailor, and lost the handle to his name, while young foremast Jim became Mr. Hall, and took up his quarters in the land of knives and forks and teacups. Sunday, October 5th. It was our morning watch, when, soon after the day began to break, a man on the forecastle called out, "Land ho!" I had never heard the cry before, and did not know what it meant, and few would suspect what the words were when hearing the strange sound for the first time. But I soon found, by the direction of all eyes, that there was land stretching along on our weather beam. We immediately took in studding sails and hauled our wind, running in for the land. This was done to determine our longitude, for by the captain's chronometer we were in 25 degrees W, but by his observations we were much farther, and he had been for some time in doubt whether it was his chronometer or his sextant which was out of order. This landfall settled the matter, and the former instrument was condemned, and, becoming still worse, was never afterwards used. As we ran in towards the coast, we found that we were directly off the port of Pernambuco, and could see with the telescope the roofs of the houses, and one large church, and the town of Olinda. We ran along by the mouth of the harbour, and saw a full-rigged brig going in. At 2 p.m. we again stood out to sea, leaving the land on our quarter, and at sundown it was out of sight. It was here that I first saw one of those singular things called catamarans. They are composed of logs lashed together upon the water. The men sitting with their feet in the water have one large sail, are quite fast, and, strange as it may seem, are trusted as good sea boats. We saw several, with from 1 to 3 men in each, boldly putting out to sea, after it had become almost dark. The Indians go out in them after fish, and as the weather is regular in certain seasons, they have no fear. After taking a new departure from Olinda, we kept off on our way to Cape Horn. We met with nothing remarkable until we were in the latitude of the river La Plata. Here there are violent gales from the southwest, called pamperos, which are very destructive to the shipping in the river, and are felt for many leagues at sea. They are usually preceded by lightning. The captain told the mates to keep a bright lookout, and if they saw lightning at the southwest, to take in sail at once. We got the first touch of one during my watch on deck. I was walking in the lee gangway, and thought that I saw lightning on the lee bow. I told the second mate, who came over and looked out for some time. It was very black in the southwest, and in about 10 minutes we saw a distinct flash. The wind, which had been southeast, had now left us, and it was dead calm. We sprang aloft immediately and furled the royals and top-gallant sails, and took in the flying jib, hauled up the mainsail and trysail, squared the after-yards, and awaited the attack. A huge mist capped with black clouds came driving towards us, extending over that portion of the horizon and covering the stars, which shone brightly in the other part of the heavens. It came upon us at once with a blast, and a shower of hail and rain, which almost took our breath from us. The hardiest was obliged to turn his back. We let the halyards run, and fortunately were not taken aback. The little vessel paid off from the wind, and ran on for some time directly before it, tearing through the water with everything flying. Having called all hands, we close-reefed the topsails and trysail, furled the courses and jib, set the fore-topmast staysail, and brought her up nearly to her course, with the weather braces hauled in a little, to ease her. This was the first blow I had met, which could really be called a gale. We had reefed our topsails in the Gulf Stream, and I thought it something serious, but an older sailor would have thought nothing of it. As I had now become used to the vessel and to my duty, I was of some service on a yard, and could knot my reef point as well as anybody. I obeyed the order to lay aloft with the rest, and found the reefing a very exciting scene, for one watch reefed the fore-topsail, and the other the main, and every one did his utmost to get his topsail hoisted first. We had a great advantage over the larboard watch, because the chief mate never goes aloft, while our new second mate used to jump into the rigging as soon as we began to haul out the reef tackle, and have the weather earing passed, before there was a man upon the yard. In this way we were almost always able to raise the cry of haul out to leeward before them, and, having knotted our points, would slide down the shrouds and backstays, and sing out at the topsail halyards to let it be known that we were ahead of them. Reefing is the most exciting part of a sailor's duty. All hands are engaged upon it, and after the halyards are let go, there is no time to be lost. no soldiering or hanging back then. If one is not quick enough, another runs over him. The first on the yard goes to the weather earring, the second to the lee, and the next two to the dog's ears, while the others lay along into the bunt, just giving each other elbow room. In reefing, the yard arms, the extremes of the yards, are the posts of honour, but in furling, the strongest and most experienced stand in the slings, or middle of the yard, to make up the bunt. If the second mate is a smart fellow, he will never let anyone take either of these posts from him, but if he is wanting either in seamanship, strength, or activity, some better man will get the bunt and earrings from him, which immediately brings him into disrepute. We remained for the rest of the night, and throughout the next day, under the same close sail, for it continued to blow very fresh, and though we had no more hail, yet there was a soaking rain, and it was quite cold and uncomfortable, the more so, because we were not prepared for cold weather, but had on our thin clothes. We were glad to get a watch below, and put on our thick clothing, boots, and southwesters. Towards sundown, the gale moderated a little, and it began to clear off in the southwest. We shook our reefs out one by one, and before midnight had top-gallant sails upon her. We had now made up our minds for Cape Horn and cold weather, and entered upon the necessary preparations. Tuesday, November 4th. At daybreak saw land upon our larboard quarter. There were 2 islands, of different size, but of the same shape, rather high, beginning low at the water's edge, and running with a curved ascent to the middle. They were so far off as to be of a deep blue colour, and in a few hours we sank them in the northeast. These were the Falkland Islands. We had run between them and the mainland of Patagonia. At sunset, the second mate, who was at the masthead, said that he saw land on the starboard bow. This must have been the island of Staten Land, and we were now in the region of Cape Horn, with a fine breeze from the northward, topmast and top-gallant studding, sails set, and every prospect of a speedy and pleasant passage round. Chapter V. Wednesday, November 5th. The weather was fine during the previous night, and we had a clear view of the Magellan Clouds and of the Southern Cross. The Magellan Clouds consist of 3 small nebulae in the southern part of the heavens, 2 bright, like the Milky Way, and 1 dark. They are first seen just above the horizon, soon after crossing the southern tropic. The Southern Cross begins to be seen at 18 degrees N, and, when off Cape Horn, is nearly overhead. It is composed of 4 stars in that form, and is one of the brightest constellations in the heavens. During the first part of this day, Wednesday, the wind was light, but after noon it came on fresh, and we furled the royals. We still kept the studding sails out, and the captain said he should go round with them if he could, just before 8 o'clock, then about sundown in that latitude. The cry of "all hands ahoy" was sounded down the fore scuttle and the after hatchway, and, hurrying upon deck, we found a large black cloud rolling on toward us from the southwest and darkening the whole heavens. "Here comes Cape Horn," said the chief mate, and we had hardly time to haul down and clew up before it was upon us. In a few minutes a heavier sea was raised than I had ever seen, and as it was directly ahead, the little brig, which was no better than a bathing machine, plunged into it, and all the forward part of her was under water, the sea pouring in through the bow, ports and hawse holes, and over the night, heads, threatening to wash everything overboard. In the lee scuppers, it was up to a man's waist. We sprang aloft and double-reefed the topsails, and furled the other sails, and made all snug. But this would not do. The brig was labouring and straining against the head sea, and the gale was growing worse and worse. At the same time, sleet and hail were driving with all fury against us. We clewed down, and hauled out the reef tackles again, and close-reefed the fore topsail, and furled the main, and hove her to on the starboard tack. Here was an end to our fine prospects. We made up our minds to head winds and cold weather, sent down the royal yards, and unrove the gear, but all the rest of the top hamper remained aloft, even to the sky, sail masts and studding, sail booms. Throughout the night it stormed violently, rain, hail, snow and sleet beating upon the vessel, the wind continuing ahead, and the sea running high. At daybreak, about 3 a.m., the deck was covered with snow. The captain sent up the steward with a glass of grog to each of the watch, and all the time that we were off the Cape, grog was given to the morning watch and to all hands whenever we reefed topsails. The clouds cleared away at sunrise, and, the wind becoming more fair, we again made sail and stood nearly up to our course. Thursday, November 6th. It continued more pleasant through the first part of the day, but at night we had the same scene over again. This time we did not heave to, as on the night before, but endeavoured to beat to windward under close reefed topsails, balance reefed trysail, and fore topmast staysail. This night it was my turn to steer, or, as the sailors say, my trick at the helm, for 2 hours. Inexperienced as I was, I made out to steer to the satisfaction of the officer, and neither Stimpson nor I gave up our tricks all the time that we were off the Cape. This was something to boast of, for it requires a good deal of skill and watchfulness to steer a vessel close-hauled, in a gale of wind, against a heavy head sea. Ease her when she pitches, is the word, and a little carelessness in letting her ship a heavy sea might sweep the decks, or take a mast out of her. Friday, November 7th. Towards morning the wind went down, and during the whole forenoon we lay tossing about in a dead calm, and in the midst of a thick fog. The calms here are unlike those in most parts of the world, for here there is generally so high a sea running, with periods of calm so short that it has no time to go down, and vessels, being under no command of sails or rudder, lie like logs upon the water. We were obliged to steady the booms and yards by guys and braces, and to lash everything well below. We now found our top hamper of some use, for though it is liable to be carried away or sprung by the sudden bringing up of a vessel when pitching in a chopping sea, yet it is a great help in steadying a vessel when rolling in a long swell, giving more slowness, ease, and regularity to the motion. The calm of the morning reminds me of a scene which I forgot to describe at the time of its occurrence, but which I remember from its being the first time that I had heard the near breathing of whales. It was on the night that we passed between the Falkland Islands and Staten Land. We had the watch from 12 to 4, and, coming upon deck, found the little brig lying perfectly still, enclosed in a thick fog, and the sea as smooth as though oil had been poured upon it. Yet now and then a long, low swell rolling under its surface, slightly lifting the vessel, but without breaking the glassy smoothness of the water. We were surrounded far and near by shoals of sluggish whales and grampuses, which the fog prevented our seeing, rising slowly to the surface, or perhaps lying out at length, heaving out those lazy, deep, and long-drawn breathings which give such an impression of supineness and strength. Some of the watch were asleep, and the others were quiet, so that there was nothing to break the illusion, and I stood leaning over the bulwarks, listening to the slow breathings of the mighty creatures, now one breaking the water just alongside, whose black body I almost fancied that I could see through the fog, and again another, which I could just hear in the distance, until the low and regular swell seemed like the heaving of the ocean's mighty bosom to the sound of its own heavy and long-drawn respirations. Towards the evening of this day, Friday, 7th, the fog cleared off, and we had every appearance of a cold blow, and soon after sundown it came on. Again it was clew up and hauled down, reef and furl, until we had got her down to close-reefed topsails, double-reefed trysail, and reefed forespencer. Snow, hail, and sleet were driving upon us most of the night, and the sea was breaking over the bows and covering the forward part of the little vessel. But, as she would lay her course, the captain refused to heave her to. Saturday, November 8th. This day began with calm and thick fog, and ended with hail, snow, a violent wind, and close-reefed topsails. Sunday, November 9th. Today the sun rose clear, and continued so until 12 o'clock, when the captain got an observation. This was very well for Cape Horn, and we thought it a little remarkable that, as we had not had one unpleasant Sunday during the whole voyage, the only tolerable day here should be a Sunday. We got time to clear up the steerage and forecastle, and set things to rights, and to overhaul our wet clothes a little. But this did not last very long. Between 5 and 6, the sun was then nearly 3 hours high. The cry of all starbowlines ahoy summoned our watch on deck, and immediately all hands were called. A true specimen of Cape Horn was coming upon us. A great cloud of a dark slate colour was driving on us from the southwest, and we did our best to take in sail, for the light sails had been set during the first part of the day, before we were in the midst of it. We had got the light sails furled, the courses hauled up, and the topsail reef tackles hauled out, and were just mounting the fore-rigging when the storm struck us. In an instant, the sea, which had been comparatively quiet, was running higher and higher, and it became almost as dark as night. The hail and sleet were harder than I had yet felt them, seeming almost to pin us down to the rigging. We were longer taking in sail than ever before, for the sails were stiff and wet, the ropes and rigging covered with snow and sleet, and we ourselves cold and nearly blinded with the violence of the storm. By the time we had got down upon deck again, the little brig was plunging madly into a tremendous head sea, which at every drive rushed in through the bow ports and over the bows, and buried all the forward part of the vessel. At this instant, the chief mate, who was standing on the top of the windlass, at the foot of the spencer mast, called out, "Lay out there and furl the jib." This was no agreeable or safe duty, yet it must be done. John, a Swede, the best sailor on board, who belonged on the forecastle, sprang out upon the bowsprit. Another one must go. It was a clear case of holding back. I was near the mate, but sprang past several, threw the downhaul over the windlass, and jumped between the knightheads out upon the bowsprit. The crew stood abaft the windlass and hauled the jib down, while John and I got out upon the weather side of the jib boom, our feet on the foot ropes, holding on by the spar, the great jib flying off to leeward and slatting, so as almost to throw us off the boom. For some time we could do nothing but hold on, and the vessel, diving into two huge seas, one after the other, plunged us twice into the water up to our chins. We hardly knew whether we were on or off, when, the boom lifting us up, dripping from the water, we were raised high into the air and then plunged below again. John thought the boom would go every moment, and called out to the mate to keep the vessel off and haul down the staysail. But the fury of the wind and the breaking of the seas against the bows defied every attempt to make ourselves heard, and we were obliged to do the best we could in our situation. Fortunately, no other seas so heavy struck her, and we succeeded in furling the jib after a fashion, and, coming in over the staysail nettings, were not a little pleased to find that all was snug, and the watch gone below, for we were soaked through, and it was very cold. John admitted that it had been a post of danger, which good sailors seldom do when the thing is over. The weather continued nearly the same through the night. Monday, November 10th. During a part of this day we were hove to, but the rest of the time were driving on, under close reefed sails, with a heavy sea, a strong gale, and frequent squalls of hail and snow. Tuesday, November 11th. The same. Wednesday, the same. Thursday, the same. We had now got hardened to Cape weather. The vessel was under reduced sail, and everything secured on deck and below, so that we had little to do but to steer and to stand our watch. Our clothes were all wet through, and the only change was from wet to more wet. There is no fire in the forecastle, and we cannot dry clothes at the galley. It was in vain to think of reading or working below, for we were too tired. The hatchways were closed down, and everything was wet and uncomfortable, black and dirty, heaving and pitching. We had only to come below when the watch was out, wring our wet clothes, hang them up to chafe against the bulkheads, and turn in and sleep as soundly as we could, until our watch was called again. A sailor can sleep anywhere. No sound of wind, water, canvas, rope, wood, or iron can keep him awake, and we were always fast asleep when 3 blows on the hatchway, and the unwelcome cry of all starbowlines ahoy. 8 bells there below. Do you hear the news? The usual formula of calling the watch roused us up from our berths upon the cold, wet decks. The only time when we could be said to take any pleasure was at night and morning, when we were allowed a tin pot full of hot tea, or, as the sailors significantly call it, water bewitched, sweetened with molasses. This, bad as it was still warm and comforting, and, together with our sea biscuit and cold salt beef, made a meal. Yet, even this meal was attended with some uncertainty. We had to go ourselves to the galley and take our kid of beef and tin pots of tea, and run the risk of losing them before we could get below. Many a kid of beef have I seen rolling in the scuppers, and the bearer lying at his length on the decks. I remember an English lad who was the life of the crew whom we afterwards lost overboard, standing for nearly 10 minutes at the galley, with his pot of tea in his hand, waiting for a chance to get down into the forecastle, and, seeing what he thought was a smooth spell, started to go forward. He had just got to the end of the windlass, when a great sea broke over the bows, and for a moment I saw nothing of him but his head and shoulders, and at the next instant, being taken off his legs, he was carried aft with the sea, until her stern lifting up and sending the water forward, he was left high and dry at the side of the longboat, still holding on to his tin pot, which had now nothing in it but salt water. But nothing could ever daunt him or overcome for a moment his habitual good humour. Regaining his legs and shaking his fist at the man at the wheel, he rolled below, saying as he passed, "A man's no sailor if he can't take a joke." The ducking was not the worst of such an affair, for, as there was an allowance of tea, you could get no more from the galley, and though the others would never suffer a man to go without, but would always turn in a little from their own pots to fill up his, yet this was at best but dividing the loss among all hands. Something of the same kind befell me a few days after. The cook had just made for us a mess of hot scouse, that is, biscuit pounded fine, salt beef cut into small pieces, and a few potatoes, boiled up together and seasoned with pepper. This was a rare treat, and I, being the last at the galley, had it put in my charge to carry down for the mess. I got along very well, as far as the hatchway, and was just going down the steps, when a heavy sea, lifting the stern out of water, and, passing forward, dropping it again, threw the steps from their place, and I came down into the steerage a little faster than I meant to, with the kid on top of me, and the whole precious mess scattered over the floor. Whatever your feelings may be, you must make a joke of everything at sea, and if you were to fall from aloft and be caught in the belly of a sail, and thus saved from instant death, it would not do to look at all disturbed, or to treat it as a serious matter. Friday, November 14th. We were now well to the westward of the Cape, and were changing our course to northward, as much as we dared, since the strong southwest winds, which prevailed then, carried us in towards Patagonia. At 2 p.m, we saw a sail on our larboard beam, and at 4 we made it out to be a large ship, steering our course, under single-reefed topsails. We at that time had shaken the reefs out of our topsails, as the wind was lighter, and set the main top-gallant sail. As soon as our captain saw what sail she was under, he set the fore top-gallant sail and flying jib, and the old whaler for such his boats and short sails showed him to be felt a little ashamed, and shook the reefs out of his topsails, but could do no more, for he had sent down his top-gallant masts off the Cape. He ran down for us, and answered our hail as the whale ship New England, of Poughkeepsie, 120 days from New York. Our captain gave our name, and added 92 days from Boston. They then had a little conversation about longitude, in which they found that they could not agree. The ship fell astern, and continued in sight during the night. Toward morning, the wind having become light, we crossed our royal and skysail yards, and at daylight we were seen under a cloud of sail, having royals and skysails fore and aft. The spouter, as the sailors call a whaleman, had sent up his main top-gallant mast and set the sail, and made signal for us to heave to. About 7:30 their whaleboat came alongside, and Captain Job Terry sprang on board, a man known in every port and by every vessel in the Pacific Ocean. "Don't you know Job Terry?" "I thought everybody knew Job Terry," said a green hand, who came in the boat, to me, when I asked him about his captain. He was indeed a singular man. He was 6 feet high, wore thick cowhide boots, and brown coat and trousers, and, except a sunburnt complexion, had not the slightest appearance of a sailor. Yet he had been 40 years in the whale trade, and, as he said himself, had owned ships, built ships, and sailed ships. His boat's crew were a pretty raw set, just out of the bush, and, as the sailors' phrase is, hadn't got the hayseed out of their hair. Captain Terry convinced our captain that our reckoning was a little out, and, having spent the day on board, put off in his boat at sunset for his ship, which was now 6 or 8 miles astern. He began a yarn when he came aboard, which lasted, with but little intermission, for 4 hours. It was all about himself, and the Peruvian government, and the Dublin frigate, and her captain, Lord James Townshend, and President Jackson, and the ship Anne McKim of Baltimore. It would probably never have come to an end, had not a good breeze sprung up, which sent him off to his own vessel. One of the lads who came in his boat, a thoroughly countrified-looking fellow, seemed to care very little about the vessel, rigging, or anything else, but went round looking at the livestock, and leaned over the pigsty, and said he wished he was back again tending his father's pigs. A curious case of dignity occurred here. It seems that in a whale ship there is an intermediate class, called boat steerers. One of them came in Captain Terry's boat, but we thought he was coxswain of the boat, and a coxswain is only a sailor. In the whaler, the boat steerers are between the officers and crew, a sort of petty officers, keep by themselves in the waist, sleep amidships, and eat by themselves, either at a separate table or at the cabin table, after the captain and mates are done. Of all this hierarchy, we were entirely ignorant, so the poor boat steerer was left to himself. The second mate would not notice him, and seemed surprised at his keeping amidships, but his pride of office would not allow him to go forward. With dinner time came the experimentum crucis. What would he do? The second mate went to the second table without asking him. There was nothing for him but famine or humiliation. We asked him into the forecastle, but he faintly declined. The whaleboat's crew explained it to us, and we asked him again. Hunger got the victory over pride of rank, and his boat-steering majesty had to take his grub out of our kid and eat with his jackknife. Yet the man was ill at ease all the time, was sparing of his conversation, and kept up the notion of a condescension under stress of circumstances. One would say that, instead of a tendency to equality in human beings, the tendency is to make the most of inequalities, natural or artificial. At 8 o'clock we altered our course to the northward, bound for Juan Fernandez. This day we saw the last of the albatrosses, which had been our companions a great part of the time off the Cape. I had been interested in the bird from descriptions and Coleridge's poem, and was not at all disappointed. We caught 1 or 2 with a baited hook, which we floated astern upon a shingle. Their long flapping wings, long legs, and large staring eyes give them a very peculiar appearance. They look well on the wing, but one of the finest sights that I have ever seen was an albatross asleep upon the water during a calm off Cape Horn when a heavy sea was running. There being no breeze, the surface of the water was unbroken, but a long heavy swell was rolling, and we saw the fellow, all white, directly ahead of us, asleep upon the waves, with his head under his wing, now rising on the top of one of the big billows, and then falling slowly until he was lost in the hollow between. He was undisturbed for some time, until the noise of our bows, gradually approaching, roused him, when, lifting his head, he stared upon us for a moment, and then spread his wide wings and took his flight. And so, my dear wanderer, as the brig Pilgrim fades into the horizon, let us rest here for tonight somewhere between the whisper of the sea and the silence of our own thoughts. The waves have told their stories, the wind has carried their truth, and the stars above, they keep the rest. Close your eyes. Imagine the slow rocking of the ship, the faint hum of ropes swaying against the mast, and the heartbeat of the ocean beneath your feet. Each sound folds softly into the next, until the boundary between dream and wakefulness disappears. The voyage continues beyond this night. There are still ports to reach, storms to face, and calm mornings waiting somewhere ahead. But for now, let the sea hold you. Let its rhythm be your lullaby. We will return to the story soon, when dawn calls again. Until then, sleep easy, sailor. You are home for now. Adrift in peace.